But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Her name is Jessica Nielson, PhD. She is a very good friend of mine, an amazing human being.
I get it.
She's going to talk about demystifying clinical trials with psychedelics, more science than therapy. Jessica is a neuroscientist and a psychedelic researcher that has been exploring the therapeutic potential of psychedelics for the past 10 years. She is leading several psychedelic research studies at the University of Minnesota, aiming to understand how psychedelics, like ayahuasca and psilocybin, may help with post-traumatic stress and depression, mechanisms for how psilocybin changes the human brain, and survey studies about the unique perspectives of marginalized groups often excluded or not represented in psychedelic clinical trials. She's also the founder and executive director of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, the Innovation Alchemist here with Big Psych, the co-founder of the Decrim-In Coalition that recently advised Mayor Fry on the executive order to deprioritize entheogenic plants and fungi in Minneapolis. And she was recently appointed by Governor Walz to serve on the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. This is the type of person we want as our scientists in society. So please give her a very warm welcome. Let's celebrate her for all of her accomplishments and her righteousness. Come on, please put your hands together.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Marcus. It's an honor and a privilege to be up here today. So I'm kind of going off script a little bit. I normally have very structured, clinical, scientific, jargony talks. And this was the original title of my talk that was in the program, because I did want to kind of walk through what do clinical trials with psychedelics look like, what's the reality of that situation, what can people wanting to engage with these expect from the process. But I'm just going to be straight with you. I'm feeling some pretty intense burnout from this whole process and having some pretty intense cognitive problems. And so I'm just going to kind of do a stream of consciousness of what my kind of personal lived experience of kind of working within this system is like. This might be helpful for people wanting to engage with clinical trials. It might be helpful for people thinking about going into the clinical research space. But mostly I just kind of want to break it down and be real with you about what all of this actually looks like and the impact that it has, both good and bad. So I've changed my talk title to this. So, Tales of a Psychonaut in Academia. Okay, so just gonna have little bullet points here to just help me keep on track. So I'm going to talk about how and why I became a scientist. I love science. That's not to say that everything that I've been experiencing through this process is to shit on science in any way. I love science. I think it's a wonderful process to try to understand how things work. But it's not a perfect system when you do it within kind of these very rigid structural systems like academia and hospitals and things like that. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges of being a clinical researcher. What does that actually look like, especially in the context of academia? Next, I'll talk about impact of some of this research, and there's so much energy going into, a lot of the research and the efforts to generate all this exciting hype. But what does that actually mean in terms of actually making an impact in people's lives versus just advancing some idea that doesn't actually trickle out into the community and translate into actually like helping people. And so I feel like impact is the exception and not the rule. Oops, I've got to go back one. Then I'm going to talk about, thinking, well, what are some other ways that we could potentially do psychedelic research in this space? Now that we've deprioritized psychedelics, I think a lot more community research and citizen science is possible. And so I'm really curious about navigating that and seeing, what might lie in that space. And then next, I'm just going to kind of pontificate about where I'm at in terms of whether thinking that clinical research kind of within this systemic structural process is the right path, not just for me, but just, to really kind of increase the impact that these things can have moving forward. Okay. Okay, so I'm a psychonaut, first and foremost. I started doing psychedelics when I was 15. I did LSD for the first time when I was 15 and then expanded to other things. But really that's sort of how I frame my sense of self and my identity is that I'm a psychonaut. I explore my consciousness. I use psychedelics to check in with myself, to get a barometer on what's going on in my life, whether I need to adjust things or not. I feel like they're a really good tool to kind of calibrate the mind and kind of our purpose and intention and mission in the world. And it's always helpful to kind of tap into that every once in a while to really make sure I'm on the right track that feels right for my higher self. And so I first kind of became aware that as a psychonaut, I could also be a professional psychonaut and do this in like a academic setting. So about 2008, I was at Burning Man. I had been going to Burning Man for a long time. For those that don't know, Burning Man's this massive festival out in the desert, kind of near Reno. It's like 60,000 people out there kind of just exploring art and community and drugs and sex and all kinds of things. It's something for everybody. I can't really explain it. It's almost like a psychedelic experience. Like you can't really tell another person what it's like until they've experienced it themselves. But there's a lot of psychedelics there, and this is where I first kind of heard of MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And they were giving these lectures there at this festival, talking about giving people with cancer psilocybin, or giving people with problematic tobacco use psilocybin. And I just thought, whoa, that's amazing that this is actually a career path I could go down. I could actually use my PhD in neuroscience and study psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca or whatever, and it could be my job. I think originally when I wanted to be a psychonaut, psychedelic researcher, I thought I want to be a professional tripper. Like I want to be the one going in and mapping the subconscious and bringing that information back. That's a little tricky. Like I technically can't be a research subject in my own study for ethical reasons. But like, I think that would be amazing because I feel like there's all these super, super deep places we can go, and not all of it needs to be related to mental health. I think a lot of it is just interesting to understand, like, how do our brains work? Why do we even have these experiences? And also just realizing that from my perspective, it seems like high-dose psychedelic experiences are really good at helping us prepare for our inevitable demise. You know, life is a death sentence. We all have existential anxiety and distress because we're all gonna die at some point. You know, and so feeling like these big experiences are really kind of preparing you for that final transition, and really trying to map that landscape. And yeah, so that kind of launched my kind of professional career into the psychedelic research space. So this is super busy and I'm not gonna go into it because this is more the style of what I usually talk about. And it's just like, I'm a data scientist, I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a psychedelic researcher, and I'm also a psychonaut. Quick question, who doesn't know what a psychonaut is? Okay, psychonaut is basically someone, like think of an astronaut, they're basically like exploring subconscious realms using psychedelics or some other form of altered states of consciousness to really kind of explore that deep, vast landscape, like an astronaut would explore space. So that's why we call it a psychonaut. So this is kind of part of some of the research I do in academia. Really, you know, first and foremost, I don't know if this, no, that's not a pointer. So over here on the right, you know, this is my research really trying to focus on, first and foremost, what's going on with trauma. So my background is working with the neurobiology of trauma. I learned everything I know about the brain and trauma through things like spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so as I've been getting more into this and really trying to look at all of these different conditions, it's interesting to think that there's so much overlap in terms of symptoms, and that all of these psychedelics that are coming through the pipeline through some of these promising clinical trials all seem to be hitting at this kind of complex constellation of mental health problems very effectively. And so I think, one, it points to these things are potentially useful to treat these conditions, but it's also helping us understand what causes these conditions in the first place, because a lot of that's not known. We all think it might be childhood trauma or something else, or genetics, or perinatal matrices, or something like that, to quote some Groffian psychology. And so I think that's interesting. But most of what we know from this whole process is really being derived through this kind of very restrictive, reductionistic clinical trial process, which doesn't necessarily represent how these things actually work in nature. It doesn't represent their uses that have been, revered for thousands of years by indigenous communities. And it's really just kind of trying to take this in isolation and understand it in a very sterile context that doesn't really reflect the real world situations that people have, not only in their illness, but then how they might want to engage with some of these medicines to help with some of these conditions. And I'm not gonna go into detail this. If you wanna geek out on all of this, I don't know if folks can see, I've got my website listed at the bottom, nielsenlab.umn.edu. I have this up on that website. All these are references to scientific papers, basically kind of trying to justify this framework for psychedelic therapy for all these different kind of neurological conditions. But the main thing I wanted to point out with this slide is that the two things that are really being pushed through right now and the things that we're gonna see access very soon are MDMA for treatment-resistant depression and psilocybin for both major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. And so those are gonna be hopefully approved by the FDA soon, and they will be prescribable and available to people within very, very specific contexts where you're kind of doing it, like you're not just gonna be getting a prescription for MDMA and psilocybin and you can go home and take it on your own. You have to do it in a clinic with 2 therapists that have gone through the training, and it's gonna be very intensive, and it's also going to be extremely expensive. So I just want to point that out. Okay, so let's get into some of the realities of what actually generating all of this evidence that's so exciting and hyping people up about the potential of psychedelic therapy and what this actually looks like in practice. So I recently had a conversation with a friend. So we have a Patreon at Big Psych. If some of you are subscribers, thank you for that. And I had been talking to one of my good friends recently just about how hard it's been to do psychedelic research at the University of Minnesota, trying to grapple with all of the roadblocks of the DEA, the FDA, the IRB, the institutional stuff, the skepticism, people being really angry about what I'm doing, people worried about what it's gonna look like in the media, like just all of that stuff has just been really taxing. And so I was talking to my friend about this and he was like, sounds like you're describing a bad trip. And as I was sitting there thinking about it, I kind of reflected on it and I made this video just kind of talking about, yeah, it does kind of feel like a bad trip, that it just feels like I'm stuck in this really restrictive system and I don't know how to get out. And, I think when you're having a bad trip or a challenging experience, you really want to try to surrender into it and just kind of let it unfold and hopefully it'll dissipate. But for me, I'm like, what does that look like? Because for me to let go, is that quitting my job? Is that just giving up on all of this entirely? I don't know how to surrender other than to, at the time I was thinking of this, just surrender to the chaos and accept that if you want to do this work, it's going to suck and it's going to crush your soul and kill you, and have a heart attack at 50, or 40 or whatever. So I was just like, what does that even look like? So that's sort of like one piece of it. The next is just kind of this real kind of grind process of trying to do things within academia. You might have heard this term publish or perish, and that is a very real thing, but it's not the whole story. You do need to publish to keep your name out there and to keep your ideas fresh and to be ahead of the game. But it's really kind of this cycle where you need funding to generate data, and then you need all that to publish papers or book chapters or things like that. And then you need all of those publications as your credit score so that you can get more funding. And it's just this cycle that keeps going and going. And if you can't get this gear going, it's detrimental to your career and there's no way to move forward because doing all of this stuff is extremely expensive. I won't go into the cost, but you hear about people getting millions and millions of dollars at research centers to do this, and that's about what it costs, paying people for their time, not only the staff, but the research participants, any equipment that you're using, renting space so that you can have your dosing sessions in a nice, comfortable area. There's just a lot that goes into it. And so this has been kind of the bane of my existence for the last like 15 years, ever since I started in academia. And it just sucks. I feel like I'm just constantly hustling for funding and having to sometimes change what it is that I want to research to fit what some funder wants. That starts to take me so far removed from what I initially intended to do that I'm wondering, like, why am I doing this? Just to stay in this toxic system, in this game that I don't really have faith at this moment is really advancing things forward in a way that is good for everyone. I think it's good for science, and it's good for FDA approval, and convincing that level of skepticism around kind of the utility and the benefit of some of these things. But most of us that have been doing psychedelics for a long time, and all the indigenous cultures that have been using them for thousands of years, they don't need that whole process. They already know. We already know. Why do we need to go through this decades-long process that costs billions of dollars? It's very extractivist. It's probably not very good for the environment either, with all the resources that go into it. So it's like, why? Why do we need to go through this whole process just to prove something we already know? You know, like MDMA, for example, that was already being used in the 70s and the 80s to treat people with what is now called PTSD that didn't have a categorization at the time when they were using it. It was used for couples therapy. And then like the rave culture got a hold of it, the DEA freaked out, they made it illegal, but it was actually being used to treat PTSD. Fast forward almost 40 years later, we're now gonna see it approved by the FDA for the thing it was already being used for in the 80s. Like, that is so ridiculous and wasteful, and there has to be a better way. Okay. What else? I'm not going to get into that yet. So part of this process, and so just one of the things about clinical trials is people seeking therapy versus wanting to support research. And I just want to kind of give like a real world, just sort of practical truth that clinical trials are science experiments. It's not medical care, it's not therapy. There might be some therapy nested in it, but it is not the way therapy is done. They're just testing whether something might work. They're testing whether it's safe. They're testing whether it's feasible, but it is not something where people, like, I feel like there's a lot, for lack of a better term, desperation from people that are suffering. And rightly so, they hear all of the media and the hype about psychedelics, and they want access to these things, and they want to be able to get the benefits that they're reading about from Michael Pollan's book, or, you know, all these things. And I think the media perspective on this has gotten really out of hand, and I've seen kind of the front end of that. So the study that we're currently running, we don't even advertise for that study, and we've gotten like over 2,000 people messaging us wanting to be in the study just from Minnesota alone. And just hearing how much suffering they go through and just feeling like this is their only hope, and just kind of knowing like this isn't really gonna get you there, you know? So it's been heartbreaking to kind of see the need and the demand and not having the right infrastructure to take that in. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, and also just like, I think I alluded to this before, but like the clinical trial system is really not what reflects the real world. Inclusion criteria are very strict, and sometimes like they're enrolling for treatment-resistant depression, but they can't have any suicidal ideation. But like that's just not realistic, you know? So like they're not really enrolling the people that actually represent that diagnosis or that population. So it's a science experiment. I think just let's be real about what a clinical trial is. It's a science experiment. It's a very tightly controlled science experiment. Okay. Okay, so I don't want to just completely shit on the whole process because it has generated a lot of attention. It has moved the needle quite a bit. We're able to talk about it more openly. We understand some of the safety concerns that some people might have that maybe, you know, because there was a lot of lack of consideration in the 60s when people were just doing LSD and psilocybin very widely in all kinds of situations, and there was a lot of hype and news around like harms that were being done and people having these really bad experiences that I think kind of precipitated the need to regulate them and crack down on them. So I think we need some of this to really figure out what is safe, because I don't think psychedelics are appropriate for everyone. some people do not respond well to psychedelics. And so I think it's important through the whole research process to understand these safety parameters for people that really haven't had experience with these, and to help have some guidance, because some people are going to want to do it in a clinical setting. People that have really been ingrained with the war on drugs and all the hype and the propaganda about how dangerous they are, that they're going to want to see that stamp of approval from the FDA in a medical setting to be able to engage with that. And I think that's fine, and there's a space for that, but that can't be the only way that people can access this. So I think there is a good process to get all that done. And I will say, even though I've had a hard time in academia, I work in a very supportive department. I work in a psychiatry department, which obviously they understand the need for mental health and self-care. And so that's been good. I think institutionally, though, and I don't want to get into trouble by throwing anyone under the bus, I'll just say that, you know, while there are individuals that I talk to at the university that are very supportive and excited about this, they're not willing to like stake their reputation on it. They're not willing to talk to the dean about it. They're not willing to talk to the regents about it. So, I'm just finding that like while it's restrictive, it also does give the ability for what we would call intellectual freedom. So being an academic is nice in that you can basically do whatever you want to do, assuming you can get it funded and assuming that the higher ups won't shut it down. So when I initially started this work in 2018 at the University of Minnesota, I got a grant and it was taken away because they were like, you can't give, I was going to do a study in alcohol, people with alcohol use disorder and giving them psilocybin. I got a grant from the university. It was an internal grant. And then they took it away from me because they're like, oh no, this is terrible. Like you can't do this. The regents are going to hate this. What is the press going to say? And it was really eye-opening and also a little bit soul-crushing. So I kind of pivoted and navigated, and I'm doing some different stuff now that I won't necessarily go into at this moment. So I feel like that's the only thing I feel is good about academia is the intellectual freedom. Is just the ability to have that flexibility, but the way that's actually implemented isn't always great in terms of being able to actually do what you want to do. And I think I'll leave it at that. Okay, so I think I should touch briefly on just what is the process of clinical trials, just so people kind of understand the different phases and what each of those are trying to do, so that if anyone out there is interested in being in one of these psychedelic clinical trials, you understand kind of which phase might be better for you. Okay. So the first one is what's called a phase 1 trial, and sometimes this is also preceded by what we would call preclinical research, so like doing things in animal models, identifying safety profiles, making sure there's like tolerability or if there's any toxicity. And then phase 1 trials really try to take that into humans and say, okay, let's look at a healthy population. Is this drug safe or is this procedure safe? And so that can be done to like test a new drug coming through. It can also be done just to do what we would call basic experiments in human subjects, which basically is like, you're not really trying to treat anything, you're not trying to understand the efficacy of a drug, but maybe you're trying to understand what is this drug doing to the body. So like the study I'm doing right now with psilocybin is trying to figure out what exactly does psilocybin do to our brains, and really tracking people over time after they've done a high dose of psilocybin and seeing like what's changing in their brains so we can figure out what parts of the brain are malleable with psilocybin, how can we tweak this, can we prolong these effects. So I think that kind of research is interesting, and that's all done kind of under the phase 1 umbrella. Then there's phase 2 trials, which is usually now you're gonna look at whether this drug might have some therapeutic potential in like a patient population. It's usually a smaller study where you're just really trying to see, is this gonna work or not, and get some basic kind of efficacy data to see, are we seeing the needle move on some clinical outcome or symptom that we're trying to help treat. And then the next phase after that, and this is the final phase that needs to be done before the FDA will approve a new drug. And so these are usually kind of replications of the phase 2 study, where then they take it into a larger population. There's usually placebo controls, multi-sites around the country. So MAPS just finished their phase 3 clinical trial with MDMA for PTSD. They did 2 separate phase 3 clinical trials. with amazing positive results, and FDA will approve this in the next year, which is great. And psilocybin is entering phase 3 clinical trials this year. So this is kind of what is needed. And then once it's approved, even though it was approved under these very strict kind of experimental conditions, once it's approved, it kind of can just be used in a variety of contexts. Things can be used off-label. So that's when phase 4 clinical trials come in. So this is when something's already approved, and then it's more of just like getting community research to be like, okay, we saw in this clinical trial that there was 5% of our participants that had this type of side effect. And now that we've taken it out and released it into the wild, what does that look like? And is that something that is still representative and something we're willing to accept as a risk for this approved drug? Or are there more things we didn't think about now that there's other people trying it? And sometimes you'll see things getting recalled because of this phase 4 process where they say, you know what, actually, this drug is not safe and we need to pull it off the market. So that's how all that works. And this is just kind of showing, right now, I think I pulled this last night, kind of just a map of the different MDMA clinical trials that are currently enrolling across the United States. You can see there's not a whole lot happening in the middle, in the Midwest here, but a lot on the coasts in Colorado and things like that. And then with psilocybin, there's a little bit more trials, and we do have some stuff happening in Minneapolis, but it's really kind of all over the place. And this isn't even showing like what's happening in Europe and Australia and South America. And so this is kind of what this looks like. If you're interested in a clinical trial, you go to this website called clinicaltrials.gov. You can enter in your condition that you have, if you have depression, PTSD, whatever, and then you can see what clinical trials are enrolling in your area. You can also refine it by selecting if there's a specific drug. So if you want to look at a psilocybin clinical trial, you can also do a search for that. But then you also have to be really careful in looking at what does this study actually do? Who are they enrolling? Because like I said, they have very strict inclusion criteria. So it's really important to kind of understand what's actually involved in some of these trials and what is the commitment. Because even though you might be getting access to something that's going to make you feel amazing, you might also be having to do a bunch of experiments and manipulations that might not make that process as healing as it could be if you weren't doing it in that kind of clinical trial context. So it's important to look at this and, again, think of it as like you want to be a guinea pig in a science experiment, and you're contributing to science, and you might see some benefit, but benefit is not a guarantee. And in a lot of these trials, there's a placebo group, so you could be in a placebo group as well. Okay. So this is the study we're doing. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it was insanely difficult to get this up and running. And I'll just leave it at that. Some other research that we're doing is kind of survey-based research, which I find to be really helpful, especially when there's not a whole lot known about how a given population might respond to something. And it's really tricky with psychedelics because people are uncomfortable talking about it because they're worried about legal issues. You know, they don't know if it's even safe to say that they've done something. If I mention I did a psychedelic, am I going to go to jail just for talking about it? You know, so I think these anonymous online surveys are good to be able to really get some preliminary information to see like where can we explore this and what is the best way to do that. So we have this study going on with people with spinal cord injury. These people are pretty much excluded from every clinical trial that's happening because they have so many cardiovascular problems and other kind of neurological issues that it's not considered safe from like a clinical standpoint to give them psychedelics, given all of the like comorbidities that come with having something like a spinal cord injury. And yet people are hearing the hype about psychedelics to treat depression and PTSD and substance abuse, which this population has. And they're doing it anyway, and some of them are having really bad reactions because of the way that their body is functioning with a spinal cord injury, that it's potentially very dangerous. And so we need more information to understand what's going on. If this is something that these people want to use, what is the best framework for that? So I think that's something where having that clinical model in a population that needs a lot of clinical care, this is a good process for trying to figure that out. So if you know anyone that has a spinal cord injury that has tried psychedelics and wants to share what reactions they had in both their kind of mental health and their physical body, please share this survey with them so we can get more data. We have data from like 20 people so far, but that's not that many. But it's I think only like 1% of the population has spinal cord injury, and then probably only 1% of those are doing psychedelics, so it's a very small target to hit to get enough. Yeah, and this is something I'm working in collaboration with Tegan Carr, who spoke before me. And then also, Tegan's been spearheading this BIPOC psychedelic survey, which she talked about before. So if folks want to scan that QR code and contribute to that, that would be really great to get more data there, to really kind of come up with better, like different outcomes that are more representative of the unique experiences of BIPOC psychedelic users, because a lot of the, as Tegan was suggesting and talking about in her talk, a lot of the research methods that are being used in kind of these clinical trials really don't capture, the cultural differences that people might have when they're taking psychedelics. So it's really important that this survey gets more data. Okay, how am I doing on time? 15 minutes? Okay. Okay, so this is happening. So there is a phase 3 clinical trial for treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin coming to the University of Minnesota at the Twin Cities. We're working out the final contracts with the supplier, Compass Pathways. They're the pharmaceutical company providing that. And so that should get started hopefully by the end of the year. They're only going to be enrolling like 9 people, so it seems almost like winning the lottery. So if you know somebody or you do have treatment-resistant depression, again, look at the exclusion criteria. It's a very strict thing that I don't know is necessarily representative of treatment-resistant depression in terms of all the other complications that come with it, but just kind of look through it and make sure if you're interested in this or you have a friend or family member that's interested to like really look through those criteria to see if you're a good fit. Because it can be frustrating. I've seen participants try to come into these trials and, they get really frustrated when they realize that, they don't meet criteria, and it can feel probably a little dehumanizing and like minimizing their experience and their pain by saying like, well, we don't think you're eligible or like you're not good enough. And that's not what they're saying, but I think that's how that can come off. And so just kind of managing expectations of what this looks like. If people want to contribute to science, this study is not providing a whole lot of psychotherapy. It's really just looking at whether psilocybin can help with treatment-resistant depression without all the extra psychotherapy. So keep that in mind as more information about this study comes out. And then one thing I want to talk about, I guess, in kind of also the struggles of doing psychedelic research is sourcing and supply, and where are we getting all of these drugs, because we can't just grow mushrooms and give them to people for some reason, which I think is really silly. So everything that's being used is coming from 2 pharmaceutical companies. There are only 2 in the entire world that we can use psilocybin for in a clinical trial setting that the FDA is okay with. And that's not okay because it's creating a monopoly and it's creating price gouging. And I'm not gonna kind of throw anyone under the bus, but there's a lot of money and a lot of effort to synthetically derive psilocybin when they grow very easily. And the problem is trying to get a botanical product through the FDA because they have very strict parameters on showing that you have to have a very specific, consistent concentration of your active ingredient, which in this case would be psilocybin, and then really trying to figure out how to get a consistent batch every time you do a grow. It's just like, it's a nightmare. I've explored this with the FDA. I was trying to do an ayahuasca study way back in the day, like around 2016, with MAPS, and it was just a nightmare, and I eventually like abandoned it. So like going through the botanical divisions of the FDA is just, it's a logistical puzzle that I don't think you ever actually get out of. You can just get like lost in the pipes there. So I think that's why decrim is so important, because I think we should be able to do these things and use the natural versions of them rather than these synthetic versions, because people are trying to create patents and create monopolies. And I think Tegan showed that graph of just all the patents that have been increasing over the years for just psilocybin. And I don't understand why so many people need to reinvent the wheel for something that we can all just grow ourselves and take. So that's frustrating. Okay, so getting to impact, I might just cover this briefly. Working within academia, it can feel frustrating to not actually see the direct impact that a lot of the work that you just grind through actually doing anything. A lot of people that maybe do animal research might never see anything that they do actually translate to help a human being. And so I just feel like a lot of it gets lost in the system, and a lot of the research that's done feels like it's more in service to personal glory versus finding life-saving scientific discoveries. And it's also about incentives. Like, people are incentivized to publish or perish and kind of keep going in this system to generate data, get papers, get more funding. And I don't see a whole lot of that actually translating to helping people and creating new therapies. And it does happen, but it is the exception, not the rule. I just want to briefly highlight 2 examples. I guess I'll just say one example for time's sake, where I was working on this study for traumatic brain injury, where we were looking at data from like the ICU, the intensive care unit, people coming in after a serious accident. And we were looking at things like intracranial pressure and surgical guidelines to try to figure out how to save people's lives, because people were just dying on the table after coming in. And we had found this value. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but we found something that was a very strong predictor of mortality in the operating room, that the senior authors of the paper held out for 4 years to publish that and disseminate that knowledge to the community, because they wanted a higher impact journal publication. They wanted to get it in one of these high impact journals that's going to get a lot of publications, which feels less about trying to help the population you're studying, more about personal glory and fame. And so there's a lot of that in this process and in academia that's just, it sucks. It sucks. And I'm not immune to it. I definitely have been playing this game for a while. I'm really starting to see how shitty it is. So that's just one example that just continually pisses me off. And I know that's not the only example. And again, publish or perish, it's just reinforced into our brains. Okay, so now I'm thinking like, well, if this whole process of doing this in academia is not that effective, what about community research? What about citizen science? This is possible. I'm referencing this amazing scientist. For those who don't know, this is Sasha Shulgin. He's the one, he didn't synthesize or invent MDMA, but he started synthesizing it in wide quantities after it went off patent in the 70s. And then he's also created a lot of these research chemicals like 2CB, 2CI, things like that. And he originally worked for some like major chemical company. I think it was Dow Chemicals. Doing research, so that's him up there kind of on the right, kind of being a goofy, probably psychonaut scientist, and starting to realize just how restrictive the system was. And so he just started making drugs in his lab and taking him and his wife, Ann Shulgin, would just make a bunch of drugs, take them, changing little things about the chemical structure, and they detailed all of that, not only how to make the drugs, but what the experiences were like in these 2 books. And so I was like, that is an amazing example of citizen science that has helped so many people understand these drugs, not only like chemically, but also experientially. So I think there is some value to doing citizen science and community research. And so I'm the executive director of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, which means technically I could operate as a research organization. And I'm just sort of wondering, is this the better path of just pushing all this stuff that I'm doing? Because I'm a scientist, I want to keep doing science. I want to keep understanding how psychedelics work. I want to keep helping promote, therapy and healing and wellness and spirituality and personal development and potential. But doing it within academia, I think, is just going to take 1,000 years to get the kind of progress we could probably get in a couple years with just doing community research with stuff that we source ourselves. So I'm not sure exactly how to implement this. It's also going to require a massive influx of cash, so it doesn't get me out of the funding grind. But I don't know. I feel like I would feel better about putting my energy. Like, I have a lot of energy. I've been able to get a lot done in my life and my career because I've had the motivation and the drive to do it. And I don't have the drive to continue in academia, seeing just how ineffective and wasteful it is. But doing it in this context, I think I have that motivation and that drive, and I really want to be putting my energy where it's actually going to make an impact and do something good, and not just get lost in the pipes of this crazy, awful system of academia and clinical research and hospitals and things like that. So I just Googled, like, okay, what do you have to do to be a science 501c3? And so there is some guidelines. I haven't really fully processed it, but I'm going to be doing some research on this and seeing how possible this is. And then just kind of some closing thoughts. So and I want to thank my husband, Brian, for helping me articulate this. Like I said, I've been having some burnout and cognitive problems, and I think I talk a lot, and then I forget what I say. And so Brian was really helpful in kind of helping me articulate this final point that I want to make. So I've been pursuing this clinical research route for a really long time, and at this point, I'm not sure if it's the best use of my energy or capacity. I think there are things that clinical trials will uncover that may advance our understanding of psychedelic medicines, but I am losing faith in this process, and I believe there's a better way to engage with psychedelics. I don't have an answer to this question of whether clinical research is the right path forward, but I know it's starting to not feel like the right path forward for me. It could be time to question the assumption that everything needs to be approved through the Western medical model, and trusting the wisdom and the knowledge of indigenous uses of plant medicines and the long history of safe recreational uses of synthetics like LSD and MDMA. Thank you, and I'll just close out with that and take any questions. I think we have, how much? 5 minutes for questions? So I think there's a mic over there. If you could go ahead and speak at the mic, just so that the camera can pick it up.
Hi. We met earlier, but my name is Christopher Duray. I'm a senior R&D engineer in medical devices, so it's an FDA-regulated industry as well, including Japan, Australia, European Union, Britain, Canada, South America, Asia, and on and on and on. They all have their own regulations, and if you order to sell your device in those regions, you must have regulatory approval from those regions. So, complicated mess. So I feel for you. I really do. What I want to say, so I've been a volunteer for several clinical trials. I was the first person in Michigan, I live here in Minnesota now, to have this experimental FDA device implanted into my head. It's called a BAHA, or bone anchored hearing aid. So it's different from a cochlear implant, but I won't go into it. It's a little bit complicated. But anyway, that was one. The device was unsuccessful because the magnet used to attach the external processor wasn't strong enough to hold it in place anyway. We have the thing in engineering called continuous improvement, which means that, okay, your device failed for the first time.
Do you have a question?
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry. Regarding ketamine, okay, specifically IV drip ketamine. I know there's different forms out there. I used it to treat PTSD during COVID. I was in Pittsburgh area anyway. I was telling some fellow colleagues here that the drug companies could change their quote-unquote intended use statement for these drugs, which means, so for every medical device, I know, I'm trying to be as short as possible, but I'm just, please forgive me. Anyway.
You said you had a question about ketamine specifically?
So the problem with ketamine treatment, it's black label and insurance companies don't cover, right? But you can change the pharmaceutical industry mind to saying that the investment in clinical studies would be I know, business, right? They all want to make a profit, but if they don't have a profit, they're not going to sell it, right? Bottom line, right? Anyway, so my question is to you, what do you think about that approach?
The intended use?
Well, to to convince the drug company that some of these psychoactive substances are worth the investment in clinical trial
Yeah.
to get their return on investment.
Well, I think this is done. I mean, ketamine is used a lot off-label for various things, including depression. It's a surgical anesthetic, first and foremost, but it is used. And I think the FDA actually did approve it for depression. So it does have an indication for that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So there are studies where you can accelerate the clinical trial process where there's already a drug approved and you just need to do a phase 3 trial to show a different use case for it. But any physician can prescribe things off-label as long as they're using their best clinical judgment. So it's not impossible, but then it wouldn't be covered by insurance and you're asking patients to pay out of pocket for that kind of stuff. Are there other questions from the audience? Thank you for your question.
Hi there. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating stuff. This feels strange to ask. I have kind of struggled with ADD, ADHD, and just being able to sort of retain information pretty much like my entire life. Do you know of any data or any studies that have observed psychedelics being used as a study drug and how that impacts the way people retain or process new information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know of anything explicitly. I know you hear a lot of stuff coming out of Silicon Valley with microdosing and nootropics that they might be useful. I don't think there's been a formal investigation, but I mean, anecdotal evidence is evidence and people say it works. I think it can help people focus, and especially with ADHD, it might help them pay attention to the task at hand.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Oh, got one.
Short guy here. So actually, this is just a scientific question. What is your hypothesis as to if we do show that psychedelics or the drug and mushroom does in fact help people with depression, what is the mechanism of the effect? How is it doing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the question is around the mechanisms for how psilocybin might help people with depression. So we know that it's changing kind of the brain's rigidity, and it's really helping the brain to be a little bit more adaptable and flexible so that it can learn something new or unlearn, a default pattern that has gotten really pathological. So it's really helpful to just kind of break that kind of process. And it's almost like cracking open the code. There's this term thrown around a lot called neuroplasticity. It's basically just a fancy term to say the brain's ability to change. And so psychedelics are really good at getting that process started. And then, there's a lot of focus on integration and really harnessing that to prolong that and drive it towards something. Because when we think about this term of plasticity, it's really context dependent and activity dependent. So you're not just getting activity, you need activity with a purpose. So you induce all this activity and then you train it into something specific that you want to do. So for depression, you're putting that brain in this state where you can then hack it and kind of rewire things, and then you combine that with some kind of evidence-based psychotherapy that we know works for depression, and then it makes it that much more effective and long-lasting.
Thank you.
One more question.
Okay. I have a question about serotonin. You're talking about plasticity as the mechanism. How much does serotonin, what role does serotonin play?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of these psychedelic drugs mimic serotonin. They have serotonin kind of at the core of their chemical structure. And we do know things like SSRIs, which make a lot more of your own serotonin available, are able to induce neuroplasticity, which is why they're helpful for people. It just isn't potentially doing it to the same extent that psychedelics are, because serotonin's acting through, not to get sciencey, but there's a specific serotonin receptor called 5-HT1A that serotonin prefers, whereas all these psychedelics are acting through 2A, which does something different. Okay, all right. Thank you everyone for your attention.
Yeah.